The Duke set the dowry chest back upon her father's table with the quiet finality of a man closing an account, and said before the assembled company that he would not take a shilling of it. Wren Calder, 26, stood near the window where the afternoon light could not quite reach her, and did not move. She did not yet know what that single refusal would cost her father, or what it would earn her instead. She would understand it before the year was out, and would thank him for it, though not in any manner the room now watching them would have thought to call thanks. The parlour at Hartwell held perhaps a dozen witnesses to what looked, in that moment, like her father's ruin. Mr. Otway, with his spectacles pushed high on his nose, two aunts by marriage come to see a settlement signed rather than unsigned, Sir Hugh Bardell invited more for form than friendship, and cousin Simeon Calder standing very straight beside the mantel, his gloves folded over one wrist as though he had dressed for a funeral and arrived early. Simeon's face held nothing at all. That, Wren thought, watching him the way she had been taught to watch a column of figures for the one number that did not sit easily among its neighbours, was itself worth noting. She had heard him, not a quarter-hour before, murmur something to his clerk in the passage, say nothing more than the sum, price, and let his Grace draw his own conclusions, and had thought little of it until now. Watching the Duke rest one broad hand flat upon the chest's rosewood lid, as though he meant to hold something down inside it a moment longer. "Your Grace," her father said, and stopped, because there did not seem to be a second half to the sentence that would not shame him further. "I have looked at the deed of settlement twice, Miss Calder, and the trust accounts once," the Duke said. "I will not spend what I have not earned the right to spend, and until the sums in that chest can be made to agree with the sums on that paper, I have not earned it." His eyes moved once, briefly, to Simeon, and returned to Josiah. "I mean no insult to your daughter." "Then you mean one to me," her father said. "Lo, I mean an accounting," the Duke said. "There is a difference, though I grant the room may be slow to see it." Someone near the door made a sound that was almost a laugh, and swallowed it. Wren crossed the room before her father could gather himself to answer, her half-boots quiet on the old carpet, and laid her hand upon the chest beside the Duke's, so that for a moment they held the same weight together. "I will take it, then, since no one else will own it," she said, "and thank you for the trouble of carrying it back to us yourself, rather than sending it by a servant who might have dropped it on the step." The Duke looked at her for the length of one full breath, the first time all afternoon he had looked at her directly, rather than at her father or the paper between them. "You are not offended," he said. "It was not a question, quite. I have not decided yet what I am," she said. "I find it takes me longer than most people." She did not yet know that he would remember that sentence for a year, and repay it to her nearly word for word, on a morning when the stakes between them had entirely changed. She lifted the chest, lighter than she had expected, and she filed that too, the way she filed every fact that did not sit easily among its neighbours, and carried it from the room without waiting for her father's permission or anyone's blessing, aware of Simeon's eyes following her the whole way to the door, pleasant, unhurried, giving nothing back. Behind her she heard Sir Hugh Bardell remark to Mr. Otway that the county assizes sat at Calvallet in 3 weeks' time, and that the trust's accounts, by the terms of old Mr. Calder's will, must be laid before the bench that same session, or the shortfall would be answered for by whoever held the estate in trust that year. 3 weeks. She carried the number up the stairs with her, like a coal cupped in both hands, careful not to let it burn her before she reached her room. She did not open the chest that night, not at first. She sat instead with her mother's account book, the small one bound in green calf with a silver clasp gone soft with handling, the one her mother had pressed into her hands 8 years past and said, "An account is a kind of honesty a body can hold in the hand, Wren. Keep this one honest, and you will never want for work in this world." She had not thought of it as a working book in a long while. She thought of it now, turning the brittle pages by candlelight, and found in the margin of a Lady Day entry, in her mother's small definite hand, a sum that did not match the sum Simeon's ledger had reported for the very same quarter 2 years running. She sat a long while with that discrepancy, before she blew out the candle, and she did not sleep, and before the sky had gone from black to the colour of a duck's egg she had dressed, taken up the chest and her mother's book together, and gone down the back stair past the kitchen, where Peg Hollis was already awake, and kneading bread with the ferocity of a woman who had never in 40 years trusted a morning to behave itself. "You're never leaving before your own father's woken to say good-bye to you," Peg said, not looking up from the dough. "I am leaving before he wakes, so that he needn't decide whether to stop me," Wren said. "That is a kindness, whatever it looks like." "It looks like running," Peg said. "Then it looks like what it is only half of," Wren said, and Peg's hands stilled on the dough at that, because in 40 years she had learned to know the difference between the girl being flippant and the girl meaning exactly what she said, and this was the second kind. "Where, then?" Peg asked. "To ask the man who returned my dowry why he thought it worth insulting my father to do it," Wren said. "I'll want the gig, and I'll want you not to tell him where I've gone until the sun's well up, and there's no sense chasing me." Peg wiped her hands on her apron, slow, and did not answer directly, which was, from Peg, its own kind of blessing. "Mind you eat something before Rennick," she said instead. A body can't out-argue a duke on an empty stomach. It was the nearest thing to permission Wren was going to get, and she took it the way she had learned to take most gifts in that house, quickly, and without waiting to be asked twice. The road to Rennick ran along the mill pond for the first mile, and a blackbird was singing in the hedge there with the single-minded confidence of a creature that had never once in its life been asked to account for anything. And Wren found herself listening to it instead of rehearsing what she meant to say, which was perhaps why what she said. When she was at last shown into the small library where the Duke took his breakfast standing, came out plainer than she had intended. "You did not shame my father for nothing," she said. "You are not a nothing sort of man. I would have you tell me what you know before the whole county decides for itself what you meant, because the county's version will not be kind, and it will certainly not be accurate." The Duke set down his cup without haste, and did not send for anyone to remove her, which she noted. "Sit, Miss Calder," he said. "I imagine you have not eaten. I imagine you are about to change the subject," she said, but she sat. He watched her a moment with the particular stillness she would come to know as his listening face, the one that gave away nothing until he had decided a thing was worth giving away. "The sums in your father's trust do not balance," he said finally. "They have not balanced by my reckoning for above 2 years, though the ledgers your cousin lodges each quarter say otherwise. I could not prove it standing in your parlour yesterday, and I did not care to accuse a man in his own house on a suspicion only, so I did the one thing I could do honestly. I declined to take money I had reason to think was not entirely there to be taken, and I watched who flinched. Did anyone? She asked. Your cousin did not, he said, which told me a great deal, since an honest trustee, accused of nothing at all, generally protests rather more than a guilty one troubles to, "And my father," she said. "Your father flinched for both of them," he said, gently enough that it did not sound like cruelty, only like an accounting. "He is being ruined by a man he trusts, and does not yet know it." She sat with that a moment, the blackbird's song still threading faintly through the window glass. "Then you did not mean to shame him at all," she said. "I meant to buy time," he said. 3 weeks until Calvallet is not much time in which to prove a fraud that has had 2 years' start on us. I judged a public wound to your father's pride a fair price for it, since a private one would have warned your cousin to cover his tracks before I could find them. He looked at her then, and something in his face conceded a fault. I did not consider, in judging it a fair price, that it would be your father who paid it, and not I. "That is generally how prices work, your grace," she said. "The person who decides what is fair is rarely the one who is charged for it." He almost smiled at that, she thought, though it did not quite arrive. "I would have your help," he said. "You keep your father's books. You kept them, I am told, before your cousin was ever named trustee, and you know his hand and your mother's both. I cannot walk into that estate's accounts without cause, and you can. Call it business, if the word sits easier with you than the alternative." "What is the alternative?" she asked, though she thought she already knew, and wanted to hear whether he would say it plainly. He did not yet. "Call it business," he said again, and refilled her cup instead of his own, which she thought, privately, was its own kind of answer. She stayed a fortnight at Renwick, under the chaperonage of the Duke's aged aunt, an arrangement that scandalized precisely no one, because it scandalized everyone equally, and in that fortnight the county did what counties do, which was talk. The wagering book at the Calvallet Inn ran 3-1 that the match was entirely off. A smaller faction, mostly women who had watched Wren cross the parlour and take up that chest with her own 2 hands, held that something odder than a broken engagement was afoot, though none of them could have said what. Lady Cordelia Ashe, who had been the county's settled favourite for the Duke's hand, before Hartwell's name was ever mentioned in the same breath as Renwick's, called upon the aunt with the particular graciousness of a woman inspecting a rival's teeth, and found Wren in the estate office, with ink on 2 fingers and Simeon's ledgers spread before her like a hand of cards she did not yet know how to play. "You are very industrious, for a young woman who has just been jilted in front of half the county," Cordelia said. "I have not been jilted," Wren said, not looking up. "I have been employed." Cordelia's mouth twitched, not unkindly. "That is a very odd thing to prefer," she said. "It is a very odd thing to be offered," Wren agreed, and finally looked up. "Most women in my position are offered pity. I find I would rather be offered work." Something moved behind Cordelia's composed face, quick and gone, and she left without another word, though she did not, Wren noted, leave unkindly. It was in that same fortnight, bent over the estate's grain accounts with a candle burned near to its socket, that Wren found the first hard thread to pull, a receipt for seed corn, dated a full year before the ink upon it could possibly have been made, by the maker's mark stamped faintly along its edge, a mark her mother had once shown her how to read on a paper twice this old. She said nothing of it yet, even to the Duke. She only folded it inside her mother's account book, between 2 pages already marked, and told herself that a fact not yet spoken was not a lie, only a debt not yet called in. It was Simeon himself who came to Renwick to call the fortnight closed. Gentle as ever, gloved as ever, smelling faintly of orange flower water in a room that otherwise smelled of leather and rain. He found Wren alone in the small library, and he did not raise his voice, not once in the whole visit, which she had already begun to understand was how he did his worst work. "Cousin," he said, "you have made a great deal of noise for so quiet a girl." "I have made no noise at all," she said. "I have only stayed where I was asked to stay, and your father sits alone at Hartwell, wondering whether his daughter has abandoned him along with his good name," Simeon said, and settled himself into a chair as though the room already belonged to him. "I have come to spare you both further embarrassment. There is a way through this that costs no one anything they cannot afford to lose. Mr. Grieve has 3,000 a year, and has said more than once that a sensible wife matters more to him than a fashionable one. Marry within the month, and the trust's shortfall, whatever its cause, becomes a private family matter, quietly made good, and never spoken of before a bench of strangers at Calvallet. Your father keeps his name, you keep your comfort. It is, I think, the kindest arithmetic available to any of us." Wren folded her hands in her lap, and thought of the receipt hidden between 2 marked pages upstairs, and did not let her face report anything at all. "That is a great deal of kindness for you to arrange on my behalf, without once asking whether I want it," she said. "Kindness rarely waits to be asked for," Simeon said. "It would not be kindness if it did. Then I will decline it, and take my chances with unkindness instead," she said, and did not move, though she felt the offer's weight settle into the room like a held breath. Simeon studied her a moment longer, his gloved hands quite still upon his knee, and something in his stillness was, she would only understand much later, closer to grief than to menace. "As you wish, cousin," he said, rising. "I hope you will not come to think, one day, that you mistook an open door for a trap." "I hope the same of you, sir," she said, and he left without answering that, which she also filed away. The Duke found her an hour later still sitting exactly where Simeon had left her, the candle burned down another half-inch. "He offered you an exit," he said. "It was not a question. He offered me a bribe with better manners than most bribes wear," she said. I told him no. "What will it cost you?" he asked, and she heard, under the plainness of the question, something that was almost fear on her behalf. "Whatever it costs," she said, "I would rather pay it honestly than be paid for dishonestly. It is the only sort of arithmetic I was ever taught to trust." He looked at her a long moment, and this time the almost smile arrived the whole way, brief and startled out of him, the first she had seen since her arrival, and she noted it the way she noted every fact that mattered, filed it without remark, though something in her chest noted it rather more warmly than the rest of her allowed to show. That same week, working by candlelight in the estate office, with the shutters drawn against gossiping eyes, they laid the ledgers side by side for the first time, her mother's small green book and Simeon's official folios, and began, sum by sum, to find where the 2 accounts parted company. It was slow work, and companionable in a way neither of them remarked upon. His sleeves turned back, ink on her fingers again, the fire burning low enough that they worked mostly by each other's nearness to the candle. "You read a column the way some men read scripture," he said once, watching her run a finger down a page without once losing her place. "My mother taught me that a column of figures never lies, only the hand that keeps it," she said. "I have found it a more reliable creed than most of the ones offered from a pulpit." He laughed at that, short and surprised out of him, and she looked up sharply, because in a fortnight she had not once heard him laugh, and understood, without being told, that she had just witnessed something rare enough to be worth remembering. "You find that funny," she said, and he shook his head, still half smiling. I find it true, which is rarer, he said. My sister once trusted a column of figures a man had kept for her, and it lied to her thoroughly, and I have spent 7 years being careful about whose hand I trust with a pen because of it. He stopped there, as though he had said more than he intended, and for a moment she thought he might say the rest of it. There is a debt I owe on her account that I have not yet found a way to. A knock sounded at the door before he could finish, a groom with word that a rider had come from Hartwell, and whatever he had been about to lay before her was folded back away, unspoken, filed on her side as carefully as the receipt in her mother's book. A promise she intended to collect on before the year was through. The rider brought word that was, on its face, ordinary. Her father wished her home before the harvest suppers began, lest tongues wag further. But beneath the ordinary words, Wren read something else entirely, a tightness in her father's usual looping hand that told her Simeon had been to Hartwell too, and had not left it as gently as he had left Rennick. She returned the next morning, the account books wrapped carefully in oilcloth against the damp, and found her father greatly changed in the 10 days she had been gone, thinner about the face, quicker to apologize for things that wanted no apology. Simeon has been kind, he told her, more than once, in the particular voice of a man convincing himself of a thing he only half believed, and each time he said it she heard, underneath, the sound of a man being slowly and courteously dismantled. It was on the 3rd evening home that the blow fell that would nearly undo the whole fortnight's careful work. Simeon called at Hartwell with Mr. Otway in tow, and a document in his hand, and laid it before Josiah and Wren both, with an expression of profound, well-mannered regret. "I had hoped never to have to show this to either of you," he said, and his voice, as ever, did not rise. "It is a receipt for seed corn, in your daughter's hand, cousin, dated a 12-month before the corn in question was ever purchased, the very sort of irregularity, I fear, that a desperate household sometimes resorts to when it wishes its accounts to look healthier on paper than they are in the granary. I do not accuse Wren of intending fraud. I accuse her only of a daughter's loyalty, covering for a father's difficulties, in a hand so like her late mother's that no clerk in the county would think twice to doubt it." Wren felt the floor of the room shift beneath her, not because the accusation was true, but because it was so exactly, elegantly false, built from the very fact that had been her chief asset, her competence. Her likeness to her mother's hand turned suddenly into a rope to hang her with. "That receipt is a forgery, and not mine," she said, her voice steadier than her hands. "Then you will have no objection to its being laid before the bench at Calvallet alongside the rest," Simeon said, gentle as milk. "And it is the truth those men are meant to weigh, cousin, not our fondness for one another. I only wish, for all our sakes, that fondness were enough." The days that followed were the worst Wren had known since her mother's death. Word of the forged receipt ran ahead of them through the county faster than any honest fact ever travelled, and where before the talk had been of a broken engagement, it was now of something uglier, a family's desperation dressed up as a daughter's crime. The Duke, warned off by his own steward, and by a letter from an aunt in town, urging him not to let his name be dragged through a country scandal not his own, kept his distance from Hartwell for 3 days that felt, to Wren, like a door quietly closing, and when he did come, it was with a plan already formed that he had not troubled to lay before her first. "You will go to my aunt's house in town until the assizes," he told her, in the estate office, without preamble. "It is not safe for you to be seen at Hartwell while this receipt is being talked over in every parlour between here and Calvallet." "You have decided this for me," she said, very quietly, and he had the grace to look uncertain, though he did not retract it. "I have decided it to protect you," he said. "That is the second time in a fortnight you have decided what protecting me requires, without once asking whether I wish to be protected in that particular fashion," she said. "You returned my dowry without warning me. Now you would remove me from my own father's house, without asking my leave. I begin to wonder, Your Grace, whether you mean to marry a wife or to manage an estate you have not yet purchased." That landed harder than she had intended, and she watched it land and did not take it back, because it was, she thought, entirely true. He was quiet a long moment. "My sister was managed instead of asked. Once," he said finally, low. "It went very badly for her, and I swore I would never again decide, alone, what another person ought to be spared. I see I have broken that oath within a fortnight of making it to myself." "Then unbreak it," she said gentler now. "Ask me." He asked her. She refused the aunt's house, and stayed, and the quarrel between them settled into something neither triumphant nor entirely healed, a debt of trust each still owed the other, filed, and not yet called in. It was 2 nights later that the darkest hour arrived in earnest. A constable came for Josiah, at Simeon's quiet urging, on the strength of the forged receipt, and a magistrate persuaded, reluctantly, that the matter could wait no longer for the assizes proper, and Wren stood on the front step of Hartwell in her nightgown and shawl, and watched her father led to a waiting cart, with a gentleness that made the whole scene worse, not better, because no one in the yard behaved as though anything cruel were happening, and everyone in the yard knew that it was. She did not weep. She had promised herself, in that parlour a month before, that she would not weep in front of people who wished to see it, and she found the habit had become, by now, simply how she was made. She went inside instead, and lit every candle in her mother's old sitting-room, and spread the green account-book open upon the table, and began at last to read it not as a keepsake, but as evidence, the way her mother, she now understood, had always half intended it to be read. Past midnight, with Peg asleep in the next chair and the fire gone to embers, she found it. A column of marginal figures running quietly beside the household accounts for 2 full years before her mother's death, quarter by quarter, in a hand grown smaller and more careful each time, as though her mother had known she was keeping something dangerous and wished it to take up as little room as possible. The figures did not match Simeon's official ledgers for the same quarters. They matched, instead, an older set of receipts Wren had seen once, years ago, in her grandfather's own hand, before Simeon was ever named trustee at all. Her mother had known. Her mother had known, and died with the knowledge folded quietly into a book she trusted her daughter to keep. Wren sat with that a long while, the fire gone entirely out, and when dawn came she was still sitting there, dry-eyed, with a plan already forming that owed nothing to anyone's protection but her own resolve. She rode for Renwick before the sun had fully cleared the hedgerow, the green book wrapped in oilcloth against her chest like something that might, if handled roughly, still bleed. She did not wait to be announced. She found the Duke at his breakfast again, as she had the very first morning, and set the book down open upon his table beside his cup, the marginal column facing him. "My mother knew, before she died," she said. "She left the proof in the one place no one but me would ever think to look, because no one but me ever thought her figures worth reading. I do not want to be protected from what happens next, Your Grace. I want to be standing beside you when it happens." He looked at the book, and then at her, and something settled in his face that she would only later recognise as relief disguised as resolve. "Then we will need Sir Hugh, and Otway, and your cousin's clerk, all in the same room before the week is out, he said. And Cordelia Ashe, Wren said. I think she knows more of Simeon's business than she has said, and I think, if asked plainly, she will not choose to protect him. Why would she help us at all? He asked. Because I asked her plainly once what she preferred to be offered, and she has not stopped thinking about the answer since, Wren said. And for the first time in 3 days, something in her chest unclenched enough to let her almost smile. Cordelia came within the day, and did not need much persuading. Once persuaded that her own name would not be dragged through the mud alongside Simeon's, she had. She admitted, tight-lipped, refused an offer of his some weeks past, an offer of marriage dressed as concern for her fortune's safety, and had thought at the time it was only vanity that made her decline him. I did not know then what I know now, she said. I only knew that a man who speaks so gently about other people's money generally means to have some of it. It was Cordelia, too, who had overheard, at a card party a fortnight since, Simeon speaking to his clerk Price in a tone she had not understood the danger of until now. Something about the Lady Day figures, and about a woman named Margaret who had asked too many questions once, long before Wren was ever born. Peg, sent quietly to Calvallet on the pretence of marketing, returned with word that Price himself had been seen drinking alone at the inn 3 nights running, and had told the landlord, deep in his cups, that he had never wanted any part of copying over figures that weren't his to change, only he hadn't the courage at the time to say so to a man like Mr. Calder. That, Wren thought, was the first hairline crack, and she meant to widen it before Calvallet, not after. The bench sat at Calvallet on a grey, close morning that broke into rain just as the hall filled, so that the last witnesses came in with wet shoulders and the smell of a summer storm following them through the door. And Wren thought, standing at the front of that crowded room with her mother's book under her arm, that it was exactly the sort of morning her mother would have found darkly funny. Sir Hugh Bardell sat the bench with Mr. Otway beside him to read the papers aloud, and Josiah stood pale but upright between 2 constables who had by unspoken agreement stopped troubling to look as though they expected him to run. Simeon stood composed as ever, his gloves folded over one wrist, and Price stood a little apart from him, sweating despite the cool room, not once meeting his employer's eye. It was Wren who was asked to speak first, since it was her name on the disputed receipt, and she did not waste the room's patience. "This is my mother's hand," she said, laying the green book open upon the clerk's table, so the light from the tall window fell full across the page. She kept these figures privately, beside the household accounts, for 2 years before her death, matching them each quarter against the sums her father-in-law had left on record before my cousin was ever named trustee. I will read you the Lady Day figure for the year my mother died, and then Mr. Otway will read you the figure my cousin's own ledger reports for that same quarter, and the room may judge for itself whether 2 honest accountants, working from the same estate, could possibly have arrived at numbers so far apart. She read the figure. Otway read the other. The gap between them was not small, and the room, which a month before had been ready to believe the worst of a poor girl's handwriting, went very quiet instead over the much larger arithmetic of a trusted cousin's. Sir Hugh turned to Price and asked him one question only, plain and unhurried. Whose hand copied the Lady Day entry into the ledger that year? Mr. Price, yours, working from the true figure, or yours, copying over a true figure that had already been struck through and altered before it ever reached you? Price opened his mouth twice before anything came out of it. And when it came all at once, the way water comes through a dam that has been cracking quietly for years and finally gives. "It was struck through before it reached me, sir," he said. I copied what I was given and told myself it wasn't my crime to question a gentleman's arithmetic. I have a letter, if it please the bench, that says as much in Mr. Calder's own hand. I kept it, I don't rightly know why, only that a man likes to have something set by against the day he's asked to answer for himself. He drew a folded, much-handled letter from his coat, and Otway read it aloud to the room, Simeon's own careful phrases instructing the quarter's total, adjusted downward, before the trustees' report went in. And the words landed in that hall with a finality no amount of gentle argument could soften afterward. Simeon did not protest. He stood very still through the whole of the reading, his composure at last visibly beginning to cost him something to hold. And when Sir Hugh asked whether he had anything to say for himself, he was quiet a long moment before he spoke, and when he did, his voice, for the first time in Wren's memory of him, was not gentle at all, only tired. "I loved her," he said. "Margaret, before your father ever came courting, Miss Calder, I asked her, and she chose the steadier man, and told me kindly that I would thank her for it one day. I never did. I told myself, managing this estate for her daughter, that I was only taking what a fairer arrangement would have given me 30 years ago. I see now that grief kept very poor books, and that I have been paying myself out of a debt that was never truly owed. It is not an excuse. I do not offer it as one." It was, Wren thought, watching him, the first wholly honest thing she had ever heard him say, and she found she could not hate him in that moment, only pity him, which was, her mother's book seemed to whisper from beneath her hand, its own kind of settling of accounts. Sir Hugh, after consultation with Otway and a long look at Josiah, who asked for nothing but that his cousin not be publicly ruined, pronounced a mercy rather than a sentence. The trust's shortfall to be made good from Simeon's own remaining property, a modest allowance retained for his keeping, and passage arranged within the month to a cousin's household abroad, the whole matter to be spoken of, henceforward, as an error in the accounts rather than a crime laid before the county's tongues. "It is not kindness to him," Sir Hugh said, for the benefit of the room, "but protection of the innocent who share his name, and I will have it understood as such. Josiah Calder, the bench finds no fault in you, nor in your daughter, whose hand was borrowed without her knowledge for a purpose she would never have consented to." The rain had stopped by the time the hall emptied, and a thin grey light came through the tall window and lay across the floor where Simeon had stood, and somewhere outside a blackbird, unconcerned with any of it, began again to sing. It was 3 weeks later, in the small library at Renwick, where they had first laid the ledgers side by side, that the Duke asked her properly, with no chest of coin on the table between them, and no crowd to watch her answer. "I have earned it now, I think," he said, without preamble, in a manner she had come to recognise as entirely his own. "Earned what?" she asked, though she suspected. "The right to spend what I have not earned," he said, "which is you, Miss Calder, though I find the word spend entirely wrong for what I mean, since I do not wish to purchase you at all. I wish only to be chosen, freely, by a woman who has never once in her life been paid for anything except in work honestly done, and I would have her know that this is not payment either. Marry me because you wish it, and for no other reason the world could name, since it is the only reason I mean to accept." She was quiet a moment, turning that over the way she turned over any sum she meant to trust with her whole self. You once told a room full of witnesses that you had not decided what you were, she said. I find I have decided at last. I am a woman who prefers to be offered work rather than pity, and I find, Your Grace, that loving you is the first work I have ever wanted for its own sake, and not because anyone required it of me. That is not quite a yes, he said, and she laughed. The first easy laugh she had allowed herself in a month. It is entirely a yes, she said. I have simply never learnt to say anything plainly, when I can say it in a column instead. They were married quietly in October, in the small stone church at Fenwick Parva, with the harvest already in and the hedgerows going gold, Josiah standing steadier than he had stood in a year to give his daughter away, and Peg weeping into a handkerchief she had sworn beforehand she would not need, muttering to anyone near enough to hear that pride was a coat too heavy for a wedding, and she had left hers hanging by the door where it belonged. Cordelia Ashley stood among the small company too, dignified and unattached, and, by every account that reached Rennick over the following year, entirely content to remain so. Having discovered in herself, she wrote once to Wren, a taste for her own company she had never before been permitted to indulge. Mr. Price kept his post as clerk under Rennick's own steward, sobered and grateful, and was heard to say more than once that he had never in his life been so relieved to lose an argument as the day the bench asked him one honest question. Simeon Calder wrote, twice a year, brief and correct letters from his cousin's household abroad, asking after no one by name but always, at the letter's close, hoping the account books balanced. Josiah lived to see the village school his late wife had once hoped to found opened at last upon the recovered trust's foundation, and stood at its door the day it opened with an expression Wren had not seen on his face since before her mother died. A year turned, nearly to the week, and on a close, warm morning much like the one that had opened this whole account, a small crowd gathered once more in a parlour, this time at Rennick, this time smiling, to watch a chest set down upon a table before witnesses. It was the same rosewood chest, its lid a little more worn, and this time it was Wren's own hand that set it down, and Alaric's beside it, together, before the assembled trustees of the new village school, endowed that day, and every year after, from the estate's own honest surplus, no shame in it anywhere, only a gift freely given, because both givers had chosen it. A blackbird sang somewhere beyond the open window, unconcerned as ever with the business of accounts. And Wren, watching the sun move slowly across the parlour floor, exactly as it had moved a year before, thought that her mother had been right after all, and said so aloud, to no one in particular and to everyone in the room at once, the books do not lie. Whatever the hands that keep them, only be patient and honest. And in time every account will balance. If this story warmed you, the quiet ledger a mother left behind, the dowry given back so it could be given honestly, the daughter who took what was hers and walked out into the dark to go and earn the rest, then come sit by the fire a while longer with me. There is a chair kept for you here, a kettle always near the boil, and no shame at all in staying past the hour you meant to leave. Tell me, in the comments, which line you would have kept for yourself if you had been standing in that parlour, the one about earning the right to spend, or the one about being paid at last in work honestly done. And if you would like to be here the next time a story like this one is told, keep your place by the fire and subscribe. I promise to keep the candle lit. Until then, sleep well, and be gentle with anyone who has ever handed you back something you thought was lost, only to watch you carry it out the door yourself, by morning, entirely on your own 2 feet.